My wife's folks sold their home, and they revealed they were coming to live with us permanently. When I voiced my displeasure, she told me we had to look after family. The papers I found in their moving boxes made everyone immediately gather their belongings that very night. It began with a casual remark, something that felt completely unimportant then, but in hindsight should have raised red flags. We were on the sofa that night, right after eating, scrolling through Netflix selections. Eliza had mentioned something about the weather, which, considering it had been pouring rain for days, was fairly typical for her to bring up. But then she added, almost like a casual observation, "Oh, by the way, my parents sold their house." I didn't think much of it at first. I wasn't surprised to hear something like that. Her parents were aging, and they'd discussed downsizing for years, moving to a calmer spot, nearer to Eliza's sister. It wasn't exactly unexpected news. But before I could respond, she said something that threw me. "They'll be moving in with us, just for a bit. They need a place to live." I stopped eating mid-bite. I wasn't even certain I'd heard her correctly. Moving in. I looked up from my phone, locking eyes with her. She wasn't kidding. She was smiling as though it was the most normal thing ever. "Hold on, what?" I couldn't help but exclaim. She just shrugged, unconcerned. "Yeah, their new place didn't work out, and they're figuring out their next steps. It's just a short-term situation, though I understand that family always comes first." I leaned back, trying to make sense of what Eliza had just told me. Her folks, Matthew and Alexandra, were both done working, living on their retirement. And I'd always thought they were pretty decent people. However, the thought of them moving into our home, permanently. Well, I guess it's not going to be permanent. Eliza jumped in, noticing I was hesitating, but she seemed completely unfazed. Maybe only a few months, until they decided what their next steps were. A few months. I had to quickly blink and rub my eyes to make absolutely sure I wasn't misunderstanding her. Eliza seemed so collected. Like this was just a normal thing to deal with, no big deal. She didn't seem to understand how drastically this could change our lives, our house, our connection. "Are you being serious?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. "Of course. I am," she answered without hesitation, not even a hint of uncertainty in her tone. "I mean, we're family. We can't just abandon them." I took a deep breath. I could feel the stress building inside me. But I didn't want to appear unappreciative or cold-hearted. She was right, wasn't she? We were a family. And helping them out was the correct thing to do. But even so, the thought of having her parents living with us for who knew how long made my stomach churn with uneasiness. Okay, so are we just going to have them living here with us? For how long exactly? She turned to me with a small smile. "They're moving in next weekend. We have tons of space." I tried to focus on what she was saying, but my thoughts were racing. I was still contemplating the things she hadn't mentioned. There was a lot unsaid. Absolutely, we had purchased this place a few years back. True, it had a decent design, but it lacked sufficient room to comfortably house 3 additional people for an extended period. The guest room, yes, it was there, but it would quickly be filled with their belongings. Matthew had a ton of old vinyl records that could easily take over the entire living area. And Alexandra. Well, she loved to constantly change the furniture around. To be honest, that particular habit really annoyed me. However, I felt compelled to stay calm. I didn't want to make this a big deal. I really, truly didn't. So I simply agreed, acting like I was totally fine with the situation. "Oh yeah, of course. Family." Eliza's face lit up. "You're so kind. I knew you'd be understanding." But as the evening went on and I tried to pay attention to the TV program, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night I went to sleep, desperately trying to get the thought out of my mind. Perhaps I was making too much of this. Everything would be okay, I kept telling myself. Just a short period of time. The subsequent few days were a whirlwind of packing crates and hectic telephone calls. Eliza spent long stretches on the phone with her folks, working out the details, and it appeared, discussing all the changes needed in our apartment to make space for them. My anxiety started to bubble up, but I endeavored to maintain a composed demeanor. I didn't want to appear resistant to lending a hand. I noticed subtle details that made me uncomfortable. For instance, Eliza's parents had begun referring to the apartment as their own. It's other people's business, not mine, to be involved in conversations. Then Matthew mentioned the sofa during the call where he confirmed their arrival. He stated that we would likely need a new one. Although the current one is fine, he explained that there wouldn't be sufficient space for everyone. He suggested we go shopping once they arrived. I just didn't have a response. I understood he wasn't intending to be impolite, but it all felt strange. Perhaps I was simply overanalyzing. Eliza's parents were generally pleasant, and I could have been overly protective of my living space. I certainly didn't want to be the one who couldn't share. The complete reality of it all truly struck me that Saturday when they pulled up with a car full of boxes. At the door, Matthew, in his usual khaki shorts and a large t-shirt, greeted me with a big smile. He happily announced, "Eliza said you've readied the guest room for us. Perfect. We'll only be staying a short while. No problem. We'll make ourselves comfortable." It really hit me hard, as if struck with a shock. It wasn't a big deal to them, but for me, this was rapidly shifting into something else. I lingered in the doorway, stunned. I felt utterly trapped, as if escape was impossible, but I still couldn't bring myself to say a word. His eyes were already bright, and the last thing I desired to do was deflate her enthusiasm. Therefore, I inhaled deeply, gave a smile, and assisted them in carrying their belongings indoors. However, as I moved away, I started observing something strange. There were more containers than I'd anticipated, significantly more. These boxes appeared to contain everything, not merely a few personal items, but a full collection of household possessions. It seemed as though they were settling in for the long haul, not just visiting for a short period. That, I believed, was the initial indication that I might have overlooked something crucial. I suppose I should have recognized something was amiss the instant I laid eyes on the boxes. They weren't simply packed with the typical items one would anticipate for a short stay: a few garments, some decorative items, and family pictures. No, this seemed like they were establishing permanent residence, the type of possessions you wouldn't abandon if you were going to live with someone temporarily. Ancient tomes, kitchen appliances, vinyl records that wouldn't fit in the guest space, and, of course, heaps of assorted paperwork that appeared to overflow from every area of the living room. I tried to avoid causing trouble, especially since Eliza was so thrilled about their arrival. She was so eager to embrace the role of caregiver. It seemed as though everything was a component of some larger scheme. To be truthful, I believe she assumed that once they were here, everything would simply resolve itself. But for me, something just didn't feel right. Error, all API keys exhausted. There were many documents, not just one, that were associated with late payments. These included mortgage issues and some kind of notice about being evicted. My hands were trembling a little as I examined them. As I kept reading, the situation got progressively worse. It wasn't just that they'd skipped a payment or two. This was unpaid debt that had built up over many months. The paperwork didn't look new either. Some of the dates went all the way back to several months ago. I put the folder down on the table and I started massaging my temples. This wasn't at all what I'd thought. This was the reason they were staying with us. They had nowhere else to turn. Eliza had never said a word about any of this. She didn't even allude to any money problems, let alone the risk of them losing their house. I attempted to suppress the panic that was rising. I really didn't want to make any snap judgments. Perhaps I was overreacting. It might just be a simple mix-up, correct? I mean, people do fall behind on their bills. Every single person experiences some hard times at some point. Yet the fact that none of this information had been shared with me felt off. They hadn't even hinted about it. Instead, I'd been given the impression that this was just temporary, a minor difficulty while they got things sorted out. I absolutely had to speak with Eliza. I needed to know whether she knew about all of this. Later that night, when she got home, I wasn't sure how to bring it up. I really wanted to stay calm to deal with this logically. But the moment I saw her walk through the door with the groceries, smiling, I felt a tight knot in my gut. "Hey, honey," she said as she set the bags down. "Everything." Was I able to hide what I was feeling? My expression probably gave me away. "Eliza, we have to discuss something," I said, attempting to keep my voice controlled. Her smile wavered just a second. "What is it?" I pointed toward the living room where the file was open on the table. "I came across something today," I said. "I think we need to address the topic of your parents." She looked at the papers and then back at me, instantly adopting a defensive posture. "What about them?" Her voice was curt, though she tried to cover it up with a smile. I settled on the couch, indicating she should join me. I wasn't sure how to put it, how to start explaining what I'd discovered without making her defensive. But I knew I had to. "Eliza," I started, "I discovered some papers, your parents' mortgage statements, and—" "They're in financial trouble," I told her. "They are at risk of losing their house." She stared at me for a moment, obviously trying to comprehend what I'd just told her. But then she dismissed it with a shrug. Well, it's just how things go sometimes. They've been dealing with some things. My aggravation was starting to grow. Just some things? This was not just some things. This was a serious issue. Why didn't you tell me about this, Eliza? You didn't think it was significant. She sat beside me, looking uneasy. I didn't want to upset you, she responded, speaking softer now. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. They had nowhere else to live. I was thinking that maybe we could help them for a short time, but I don't want you to feel like it's a hardship. It bothered me. She was completely avoiding my point of view. I wasn't irritated that I was being helpful, but this wasn't a short-term favor. They had no other option, and Eliza had conveniently failed to mention that fact. I began to speak, to argue my side, but she interrupted me, her tone now more forceful. Joseph, you have to get it. We have to support our family. It's the correct course of action. I don't know what to say to make you understand. I could feel the pressure of what she was saying, yet it didn't negate the fact that she actually did it. Had kept something enormous from me. She'd simply expected us to volunteer without any discussion. I'm okay with assisting, Eliza, but this is, I paused, trying to choose the right words. This is more than just offering assistance. You failed to inform me of their issues, and now they are here, permanently, and I'm just supposed to accept it. She folded her arms, turning away. I don't understand what the issue is, Joseph. They're our family. We have to help them. And it was at that moment that I saw what I'd imagined was a temporary problem was turning into something extensive, and I wasn't. Positive I was equipped to deal with it. As she walked away to get a drink, I remained there in the ever-growing quiet. My thoughts were spinning. What was truly happening here? Was I making too big a deal out of it? Or had Eliza totally caught me off guard by not recognizing what was truly at risk? I lacked the solutions at the moment, but I was sure of one thing. I was starting to feel imprisoned, and I didn't know how much longer I could. I kept acting like everything was normal, even though it wasn't. The following few days were a blur. I started staying away from the living room because their possessions were continuing to pile up. I struggled to remain calm, yet it felt like each day something else about the situation became more complicated. What had Eliza gotten us into, truly? And how far would I be pushed before I couldn't hide from reality anymore? I understood I needed to take action, although I didn't know exactly what that action would be. It had been several weeks since Eliza's folks had moved in, and everything had become significantly worse. The way we were living was oppressive. The mess, the stress. I was constantly being careful, not wanting to annoy Eliza, but I was starting to strongly dislike every square inch of our apartment. There were subtle things I could no longer overlook, such as the way Matthew would disregard my personal boundaries without asking. Using my computer, rummaging through my belongings, behaving like it was all his property, or how Alexandra would scatter incomplete projects everywhere as if she was the owner of the place. Furthermore, there were the remarks, the casual comments from Eliza's parents, as if I should simply be appreciative for the assistance they were giving us. Being around them was agonizing, and I felt like I was losing control of my own existence. However, it wasn't just their fault. It was also Eliza. Each discussion we had about it always culminated with her giving me that expression, the one that indicated she couldn't believe I wasn't more thankful. I'd attempted. I really tried to be understanding. Honestly, I did. However, the reality was I felt like I was in a prison, and Eliza just wouldn't understand. She didn't see that I was struggling to stay afloat. One evening, I just couldn't handle it any longer. Since Eliza was out with her friends, I had a much-needed quiet moment. I'd spent hours alone with her parents, and they seemed to be settling in more and more each day. Matthew was engrossed in a documentary about something nobody ever watches, and Alexandra was organizing my bookshelves. Yet again, I was furious. Still, I remained silent, staying away from them, just trying to survive until bedtime. It was then that I spotted it. A small pile of papers, partially concealed beneath some old photo albums that had been left on the sofa. I wasn't sure why, but I felt a need to look closer, as though an inner voice was prompting me. Perhaps it was the last bit of doubt I had. Deep down, I knew I had to confirm what I'd worried about for several weeks. I opened one of the papers. I was devastated. It was yet another foreclosure notice. A final, serious warning, but this one wasn't from the bank. It was from the IRS. Here's the thing, I realized that. Eliza hadn't mentioned any of this to me. She had told me they were just between homes, that they needed a small amount of help. But the papers showed an entirely different reality. Her parents weren't merely having trouble with their mortgage. They were in enormous debt, and it looked like they hadn't been honest with her about just how bad it was. They were practically out of options. That's when it all became clear. They came to live with us not due to a lack of options, but because they were out of them. I'd come to understand their money problems were significantly more serious than I'd been told, and we were being utilized as their safety net, with the expectation we'd let them stay indefinitely without any resistance. Eliza had completely believed their account of things, and I'd accepted her perspective too. But I decided this wasn't going to continue. That evening, when Eliza got back, I was seated on the sofa, those documents in front of me. I didn't even glance up as she walked into the apartment. "Are you all right?" she inquired in a gentle tone. I didn't respond at once. I was just worn out from acting. I was done with trying to be the nice guy, the one who constantly buried his feelings. I needed her to acknowledge the truth, the reality I saw. "Take a seat," I stated, my voice controlled but assertive. She instantly felt something was amiss. "What's the matter?" I slid the paperwork towards her without a word. She picked them up, quickly looking over the pages. As she read more, her expression changed from bewilderment to astonishment. I don't get it," she stammered, her gaze darting between the papers and me. "Why didn't you inform me?" I asked, my voice now laced with tension. "Why didn't you tell me the real situation with your parents?" Eliza paused, her lips quivering as she examined the papers. I didn't think it was that awful." "No, you didn't," I said, now rising to my feet. "You didn't think it was that bad because you were too occupied." I played the victim, believing everything they told me without a second thought. "And now we're in this awful situation because you kept the truth from me." She jumped up, immediately defensive. "What am I supposed to say, Joseph? They're my folks. I'm just trying to assist them." I gave my head a little shake. "You aren't helping them at all. You're allowing them. They've been taking advantage of you, and as a result of us too." I could feel my heart racing, but I wouldn't back down. "Look at this," I said, gesturing to the documents. "They're completely buried in debt, and you've let them move in as if it was just some small favor. Do you honestly think this is short-term? Do you believe they're going to leave anytime soon?" Eliza's eyes were now enlarged, but she didn't say anything. She just gazed at the paperwork like it was something she couldn't understand. "I've reached my breaking point, Eliza," I said, the full burden of the situation finally hitting me. "You have to decide. Either you solve this problem or we're over. I can't keep living this way." Her face lost color. I could see the pain in her eyes, but also the fury. She started to say something, but I wasn't finished. "I'm not just talking about them moving in here. I'm also talking about you. You've allowed them to destroy everything for us because you were too scared to have a hard conversation with them. I'm done pretending like this is acceptable." She gazed at me, her eyes displaying both anger and a sense of being betrayed. But before she could argue, I raised my hand to stop her. "You need to fix this, Eliza. It's not just about them anymore. It's about. We have to establish limits, and we need to do it immediately." I could see she was torn between the affection she felt for her folks and the slowly dawning understanding that I was correct. She had to confront the reality of the situation. I hated to be the one who had to deliver bad news. However, at this moment, I wasn't left with any other option. The following day, Eliza came to me, and to my amazement, she agreed with me. She said she'd spoken with her parents and challenged them regarding the debt and the way they had taken advantage of her. Naturally, they were stunned, but the facts finally came out. They had concealed their money problems for an extended period, and Eliza had been oblivious. But now things were shifting. Eliza was on my side while we clearly defined limits with her parents. They were required to sort out their money and devise a plan to leave within the next 4 weeks. It definitely wasn't simple, yet we accomplished it. And for the first time in ages, I felt a burden lighten. We were no longer stuck. Concerning Eliza's parents, they weren't thrilled, but they understood the situation had altered. To be honest, I felt a small amount of pleasure in seeing them sweat for a change. But the best part was I finally felt like I was regaining command of my life, and maybe, just perhaps, everything would be all right.